The foundation of Inside Power content follows a precise 7-act structure that transforms news analysis into investigative narrative. This architecture maintains viewer attention across 25 to 35-minute durations while maximizing algorithmic performance and audience retention. A par in par. Act 1. Authority establishment and stakes declaration. Minutes 0 to 3. Par in par. The opening segment establishes the presenter as a credible investigative authority while immediately communicating the significance of the content. This act begins with the presenter identifying themselves using full name and title, followed immediately by the phrase "breaking news tonight" to trigger urgency and relevance signals in viewer psychology. And par in par. The first 60 seconds must accomplish three critical objectives. First, it identifies the specific event or revelation being investigated using precise terminology. Examples include federal criminal investigation, sealed court documents, or confidential internal communications. Second, it establishes the stakes through explicit consequence statements such as could result in criminal charges carrying up to 10 years in prison or threatens to expose systematic deception spanning 7 years. Third, it positions the content as exclusive investigation that mainstream media either refuses to cover or lacks access to investigate properly. And par in par, the authority establishment continues with source validation language. Phrases such as, according to documents obtained exclusively by our investigative team and sources with direct knowledge of the situation, create the impression of primary source access. The inclusion of specific identifying details reinforces this impression. Examples include exact dates formatted as January 17, 2025, precise financial figures such as $2, 3 million, legal case numbers formatted as case number BD2501847, and named institutions like Los Angeles Superior Court or IRS Criminal Investigation Division. In par in par. The Act concludes with a mandatory subscription prompt that establishes content value proposition. The language emphasizes exclusivity and consequence using phrases such as, what you're about to hear is not being reported anywhere else. This involves federal crimes with real evidence, and they don't want this story out, but you deserve the truth. This segment should consume approximately 90 seconds and must occur before the 3-minute mark to capture casual viewers before the retention cliff that typically occurs at this timestamp. Oni par in par. Act 2. Evidence validation and credibility architecture. Minutes 3 to 7. E par in par. Following the opening hook, the second act focuses entirely on establishing that the investigation rests on verifiable evidence rather than speculation or rumor. This segment addresses viewer skepticism directly by anticipating and answering the question, how do we know this is real? Napar, the evidence validation sequence presents multiple independent confirmation streams. The script should enumerate at least 3 and preferably 5 separate corroboration sources. The presentation format follows this structure. First, we have the physical documents themselves, followed by specific details about page count, format characteristics, and technical elements that only authentic documents would contain. Second, we have corroboration from multiple independent sources, followed by identification of source types without revealing identities, such as 3 palace staff members, 2 law enforcement officials, or 5 event attendees. Third, we have supporting financial records or communications metadata, or expert analysis from credentialed professionals, with each stream providing different angles of verification. En par non par, the credibility architecture includes strategic acknowledgement of limitations, phrases such as, while we don't have video footage of the event, or the hospital has not officially commented, demonstrate journalistic integrity while actually strengthening belief in the claims being made. This technique operates on the principle that acknowledging minor gaps in evidence makes the major claims appear more thoroughly vetted. Au par. This act also introduces the key players and establishes their roles in the narrative. Each significant figure receives a title and brief context statement. For example, Meghan Markle, Duchess of Sussex and subject of the investigation, or William, Prince of Wales and future King of England, who has been compiling evidence for 7 years. These introductions establish the dramatic stakes through status and title rather than requiring emotional characterization. E par in par. Act 3. Comprehensive evidence presentation, minutes 7 to 20. IPAR. The third act represents the largest segment of content and contains the substantive investigative material. This section transforms raw information into compelling narrative through strategic organization and presentation techniques. PAR. The evidence presentation follows categorical architecture rather than chronological sequence. The script divides evidence into 5 to 8 major categories, each receiving between 2 and 4 minutes of detailed examination. Category titles use parallel structure and specific terminology. Examples include financial irregularities and misuse of funds, staff testimony regarding workplace behavior, media coordination and narrative management, legal documentation discrepancies, and expert analysis of behavioral patterns. NPAR. Within each category, the presentation follows a consistent 3-part microstructure. First comes the category Introduction, which states what type of evidence will be examined and why it matters to the overall investigation. Second comes the detailed evidence presentation, which includes specific examples, quoted materials, and numerical data. Third comes the synthesis statement, which explicitly connects this category's evidence to the broader pattern being established. IPAR. The evidence presentation employs numerical precision as a credibility and retention technique. Every claim that can be quantified should be quantified with exact figures. Instead of substantial payments, the script states wire transfers totaling exactly $547,000 distributed across 5 officers. Instead of many staff members complained, it specifies testimony from 47 Palace employees, 23 of whom signed sworn statements. Instead of expensive renovations, it itemizes $2.3 million charged to the foundation accounts, broken down as follows. NPAR. Each major category includes at least one specific detailed example that receives extended treatment. This example serves multiple functions. It provides concrete illustration of the abstract pattern being described. It creates memorable imagery that viewers can recall and discuss with others. It demonstrates the thoroughness of the investigation by showing that researchers examined individual transactions rather than relying on summaries. The detailed example should consume between 60 and 90 seconds and should include specific dialogue, transaction details, or documentary evidence. NPAR. The pacing within Act 3 alternates between rapid-fire presentation of multiple examples and analytical slowdowns that explore implications. Rapid sections use short declarative sentences with parallel structure. March 2024, the first payment is made. April 2024, suspicious access patterns are detected. May 2024, investigators trace the activity to California. These segments create momentum and convey volume of evidence. Analytical sections use longer, more complex sentences that signal importance and provide interpretive frameworks. This pattern demonstrates not merely carelessness or poor judgment, but rather a systematic effort to circumvent established protocols while maintaining an appearance of compliance. IPAR. Act 4. Timeline reconstruction and pattern demonstration, minutes 20 to 25. PAR. The fourth act shifts from categorical evidence presentation to chronological timeline reconstruction. This structural transition serves multiple purposes. It provides pacing variety after the dense evidence section. It demonstrates how individual incidents connect across time to form patterns. It creates narrative momentum by showing escalation and progression toward crisis. It establishes intent by proving that behaviors were repeated despite warnings or consequences. IPAR. The timeline format presents date-stamped entries in chronological sequence with consistent formatting. Each entry follows this structure: the date in bold or emphasized formatting, a colon, then a brief description of the event or action, followed by contextual detail or significant statement. The timeline should include between 15 and 30 entries spanning multiple years to demonstrate the comprehensive nature of the investigation and the sustained duration of the problematic behavior. NPAR strategic repetition occurs throughout the timeline to reinforce the pattern. After every 4 to 6 entries, the script pauses for a pattern recognition statement. Notice the repetition here, or this is the 3rd time in 5 months that this exact behavior occurs, or the escalation becomes clear when we see these events in sequence. These interruptions prevent timeline fatigue while emphasizing the investigative interpretation that viewers should adopt. IPAR. The timeline section concludes with a definitive pattern statement that synthesizes the chronological evidence into a prosecutorial conclusion. This statement uses legal or clinical terminology to frame the behavior. This timeline establishes not isolated incidents, but rather a systematic pattern of deception carried out with full knowledge of consequences, or what emerges from this chronological analysis is a textbook case of escalating manipulation consistent with coercive control patterns identified by behavioral psychologists. NPAR NENPAR ER Act 5, Legal and Practical Consequences Exposition, minutes 25 to 28. PAR IGBR. The Fifth Act transitions from what happened to what it means in terms of concrete consequences. This section addresses the question, so what? By detailing the legal, financial, reputational, and practical implications of the evidence presented. On par, the consequences exposition follows tiered architecture moving from most certain to most speculative. The first tier addresses undisputed legal or procedural consequences. Under California law, falsifying business expense reports constitutes fraud under Penal Code Section 532, or immigration law provides no discretion when visa applications contain materially false statements. Deportation proceedings are mandatory. These statements cite specific statutes, regulations, or established precedents to create an air of inevitability. Upper and par, the second tier addresses likely consequences based on precedent and expert opinion. Federal prosecutors in cases with this level of documentary evidence typically pursue maximum charges, or charity watchdog organizations will certainly investigate given these overhead percentages. These statements use qualifying language such as typically, likely, or in similar cases, while still conveying high probability. Subpar and par. The third tier presents possible consequences that depend on choices made by the subjects or authorities. If the family decides to pursue title revocation, the process would require parliamentary involvement, or, should investigators discover additional evidence of coordination, conspiracy charges could expand the case. These conditional statements extend the narrative into future installments while maintaining the analytical framework, in pair. Throughout the consequences section, the script emphasizes irrevocability and irreversibility. Phrases such as, there is no undoing this violation, this damage is permanent, and these consequences cannot be negotiated away, create gravity and finality. This technique serves retention by suggesting that viewers are witnessing a definitive turning point rather than one incident in an ongoing saga that could be reversed in future developments. Aparnapartigi, Acta 6, Scenario Analysis and Outcome Projection, minutes 28 to 32. Parnempper. The Sixth Act presents multiple potential outcome scenarios, creating a choose-your-own-adventure analytical structure that maintains engagement through curiosity about which scenario will materialize. This section typically presents 4 to 5 distinct scenarios, each labeled explicitly as Scenario 1, Scenario 2, continuing through the sequence. Par. Each scenario receives between 60 and 90 seconds of development following a consistent internal structure. First comes the scenario summary statement, which identifies the key choice or event that defines this pathway. Scenario 1, full admission and plea for mercy, or Scenario 2, aggressive denial and victim narrative. Second comes the action description, which details the specific steps that would constitute this scenario. In this scenario, the subjects would proactively release a statement acknowledging the use of surrogates, express regret for the deception, and request understanding for their privacy choices. Third comes the consequence analysis, which explains what would happen if this scenario unfolds. This approach would generate intense criticism and potential legal consequences, but it represents the least damaging long-term option because it demonstrates honesty and accountability. Fourth comes the probability assessment, which evaluates how likely this scenario is based on the subject's character, resources, and precedent. However, this scenario requires admitting fault, which contradicts every pattern of behavior demonstrated over 7 years, making it the least likely option despite being the most strategically sound. In par. The scenario sequence should be ordered from most favorable outcome for the subjects to least favorable. This structure creates escalating dramatic tension as each subsequent scenario becomes more catastrophic. The sequence typically follows this progression: settlement or reconciliation with minimal public disclosure, partial admission with mitigating circumstances, aggressive legal defense that prolongs the situation, default or failure to respond leading to worst-case rulings, and complete collapse, including bankruptcy or criminal prosecution. IPAR and IPAR. After presenting all scenarios, the script includes a meta-analytical statement that assesses which scenario is most likely and why. This assessment references the character patterns, resource constraints, and precedents established earlier in the script. Based on everything we have examined, the pattern of denial, the legal strategy employed in previous controversies, and the financial constraints they currently face, scenario 2 represents the most probable path, though it ultimately leads to scenario 4 when the aggressive defense fails. In par. Act 7. Urgency Reinforcement and Engagement Call to Action. Minutes 32 to 35. Par. The final act creates closure while simultaneously establishing anticipation for future installments. This segment reinforces the temporal urgency established in the opening by referencing approaching deadlines. The 30-day deadline expires in 17 days. The Netflix deal ends in September 2025, just 8 months away. Or, federal prosecutors are expected to announce their decision within weeks. NPAR. The summary statement recaps the most important elements using parallel structure and precise repetition of key figures. King Charles has given Prince Harry exactly 30 days to choose between his wife and his family. If Harry chooses to remain with Meghan, he faces permanent title stripping, complete financial cutoff, and estrangement from everyone he grew up with. If he chooses to leave Meghan, he must admit that critics were right, return to the family with diminished status, and rebuild relationships damaged by 7 years of public attacks. There is no middle ground, there is no compromise, there is only choice and consequence. NPAR. The engagement call to action employs multiple techniques to drive measurable interaction. The primary technique is the polling mechanism, which asks viewers to type specific responses in comments. Type divorce if you think Harry should leave Meghan and return to his family. Type stay if you think he should choose love over titles. Type rebel if you think he should refuse to engage with the ultimatum entirely. This technique generates comment volume that algorithms reward while providing social proof of engagement that encourages additional participation. IPAR. The secondary engagement technique is the conditional value proposition for subscription, which explicitly states what viewers will miss if they do not subscribe. If you want to know what happens when the 30-day deadline expires, when federal prosecutors announce their decision, when the hospital records are finally made public, you need to subscribe and hit that notification bell right now because this story is moving fast and the next development could happen at any moment. This language transforms subscription from general channel support into specific information access. SPARNAPAR. The final element is the cliffhanger bridge to the next video, which identifies the next investigative target while suggesting it will be even more explosive. Because what we have covered tonight is just the financial dimension of this scandal. The real question, the question that goes to the heart of royal legitimacy itself, is whether the Sussex children are actually who we have been told they are. And the evidence on that front is even more disturbing. I am George Will, and I will see you in the next investigation. NPAR near retention, hook deployment system, your hook placement architecture. NPAR retention hooks represent specific techniques deployed at strategic intervals throughout the script to prevent viewer drop-off at predictable attrition points. The Inside Power framework employs 5 categories of retention hooks distributed according to viewer psychology research and algorithm optimization principles. NPAR, opening hook, 000 to 030. PAR. The opening 30 seconds contain the highest impact hook of the entire video because this segment determines whether casual viewers become committed viewers. The opening hook must communicate threat, urgency, exclusivity, and authority simultaneously. NPAR. The optimal opening hook structure begins with the presenter identification and immediately states the most shocking single fact from the investigation. Good evening, George Will here. Breaking news tonight. Federal agents have raided the Archewell Foundation headquarters, seized 4 years of financial records, and are preparing criminal fraud charges against Prince Harry and Meghan Markle that could result in 10 years in federal prison. This single sentence establishes presenter authority, confirms news value through the breaking news frame, provides specific detail with 4 years of financial records, and communicates maximum stakes with 10 years in federal prison. NPAR. The opening hook should avoid preamble, context setting, or background information. Viewers in the first 30 seconds have not yet committed to watching and will exit if they do not immediately understand why this content deserves their time. Context and background come later, after the hook has secured their attention. NPAR credibility hooks, every 3 to 4 minutes. NPAR credibility hooks interrupt the narrative flow to reinforce that the investigation rests on solid evidence rather than speculation. These hooks combat the natural skepticism that accumulates as viewers process dramatic claims. The deployment interval of every 3 to 4 minutes aligns with the natural attention cycle in which viewers periodically question whether they should continue investing time in content. NPAR credibility hooks follow consistent linguistic patterns that signal evidential grounding. Phrases include, according to documents we have obtained, 5 separate sources confirmed, banking records show, emails obtained through legal discovery prove, and expert analysis concludes. These phrases should introduce specific new pieces of evidence rather than simply reasserting general credibility. NPAR. The most effective credibility hooks include technical detail that casual observers would not know but can be verified by sophisticated viewers. Examples include, the email metadata timestamp shows it was sent at 3:47 a.m. Pacific Time, which corresponds exactly with when Meghan's team claims she was asleep, or the invoice uses Portland Hospital's standard format, including the provider number 847362, which matches their registered NHS identification. NPAR numerical precision hooks, every 5 to 7 minutes. NPAR numerical precision hooks leverage the psychological impact of specific figures to create impressions of thorough investigation and objective quantification. These hooks interrupt narrative sections with exact financial figures, precise timekeeping, specific counts, or detailed measurements. NPAR. The deployment pattern for numerical precision hooks alternates between financial figures and temporal precision. A sequence might include $2,347,190 in total advances, followed 3 minutes later by the meeting lasted exactly 47 minutes, followed 4 minutes later by testimony from 47 palace staff members, followed 3 minutes later by the deadline expires in exactly 17 days. NPAR numerical precision hooks should emphasize the exactitude through word choice. Instead of about $2 million, the script states exactly 2,047,890. Instead of several weeks, it specifies 23 days. Instead of many witnesses, it quantifies 47 staff members. The precision itself becomes evidence of investigative rigor. NPAR. Comparative escalation hooks, every 8 to 10 minutes. NPAR. Comparative escalation hooks maintain dramatic momentum by explicitly positioning each new revelation as more significant than what preceded it. These hooks prevent the narrative flatness that occurs when multiple serious allegations blur together into undifferentiated scandal. NPAR. The linguistic structure of comparative escalation hooks uses explicit transitional phrases, but it gets worse. Here's where this becomes truly shocking. What I am about to reveal makes everything we have discussed so far look trivial, or this next piece of evidence is the most damning of all. These phrases create anticipation peaks that drive retention through the subsequent segment. NPAR comparative escalation requires actual escalation in content. The script cannot repeatedly claim this is the most important part without delivering progressively more significant information. The framework addresses this challenge through strategic evidence sequencing, which reserves the most dramatic revelations for the second half of the video. The first half establishes pattern and context. The second half delivers explosive specifics that the context makes comprehensible. NPAR. Scenario, curiosity hooks. Act 6. NPAR scenario curiosity hooks operate differently than other retention mechanisms because they create multiple minor cliffhangers within a single section. Each scenario presentation ends with a probability assessment that creates curiosity about which scenario will actually occur, while the presentation of multiple scenarios creates investment in seeing all options before making a personal prediction. Shiu par no par. The scenario sequence naturally generates retention because viewers who wish to form educated opinions about likely outcomes must watch all scenarios to understand the full range of possibilities. The framework leverages this dynamic by explicitly stating you cannot evaluate which scenario is most likely until you have seen all 5 options, so stay with me as we walk through each possibility. Sien par en par Narwar's pacing system and rhythm architecture par en par Narwar 3-speed pacing model na par en par. The Inside Power framework employs 3 distinct pacing speeds that alternate throughout the script to prevent monotony while matching rhythm to content type. These speeds are rapid presentation, analytical examination, and dramatic pause. Yapar Nempari rapid presentation speed used in timeline sections and evidence lists. Par rapid presentation uses short declarative sentences with parallel grammatical structure delivered in quick succession. The sentence length averages 8 to 12 words. The structure repeats across multiple sentences to create rhythmic momentum. The presenter's vocal delivery should accelerate slightly, though not to the point of becoming difficult to follow. In par example of rapid presentation speed. March 2024, the investigation begins. April 2024, phishing emails are sent to hospital staff. May 2024, stolen credentials are used to access medical databases. June 2024, over 40 hours of unauthorized access occurs. July 2024, investigators trace the activity to California. August 2024, British intelligence notifies the FBI. September 2024, search warrants are executed. Nimpar, the rapid speed communicates volume, thoroughness, and momentum. It creates the impression that evidence is abundant and investigators are highly active. The rhythm itself becomes a form of proof, as the steady accumulation of dated entries suggests comprehensive documentation rather than cherry-picked examples. On par. Analytical examination speed, used in interpretation sections and legal analysis. On par, analytical examination speed employs longer, more complex sentences with subordinate clauses, qualifying phrases, and sophisticated vocabulary. The sentence length averages 20 to 30 words. The structure includes explicit reasoning markers such as therefore, consequently, this demonstrates, the significance lies in, and what this reveals. In par example of analytical examination speed. The significance of this timeline lies not in any single transaction, but rather in the systematic pattern that emerges when these incidents are examined in sequence. What we observe is not impulsive behavior or occasional lapses in judgment, but rather a carefully planned operation that demonstrates clear understanding of legal boundaries and deliberate decisions to exceed those boundaries while maintaining plausible deniability through careful documentation practices. Nepar, the analytical speed signals importance and invites cognitive engagement. The longer sentences and complex structure communicate that this section requires careful attention and rewards thoughtful processing. The vocabulary choices position the content as sophisticated analysis rather than gossip or speculation. Par, dramatic pause speed used at major revelation moments. Par, dramatic pause speed breaks the normal sentence rhythm with very short statements that stand alone. These statements are preceded and followed by longer contextualizing sentences, creating a rhythmic interruption that draws attention to the isolated statement. The pause statement itself typically consists of 3 to 7 words. Par, example of dramatic pause deployment. Now you might be asking, what about the official birth certificates? What about the hospital announcements? Surely those documents prove the births occurred as described. Let me show you why that assumption is wrong. Dramatic pause statement. The hospital has no records.